Silence becomes powerful in unhealthy dynamics because it is rarely neutral. When you are dealing with a narcissistic person, your silence is not interpreted as grace, maturity, or emotional intelligence. It is interpreted as compliance. It is interpreted as agreement, and most dangerously, it is interpreted as proof that their behavior works. At first, you may stay silent because you are trying to prevent escalation. You have likely seen what happens when you challenge them. The defensiveness, the blame, shifting, the rewriting of history, the rage, or perhaps the icy withdrawal. So you decide it is easier to let it go. You tell yourself it's not worth it. You convince yourself that choosing quiet is choosing peace. But what you are actually doing, slowly and unintentionally, is teaching them that there are no consequences for how they treat you. In healthy relationships, silence during conflict can mean reflection. It can mean someone is thinking, regulating, or choosing their words carefully. But in a narcissistic dynamic, silence is not processed that way. A narcissistic person often operates from entitlement and a need for dominance. When you do not push back, they do not think they are being thoughtful, they think I won. That internal sense of victory reinforces the behavior. It strengthens it. Behavior that is rewarded gets repeated. This is basic psychology. If someone lies and nothing happens, they are more likely to lie again. If someone criticizes and there is no pushback, they are more likely to criticize again. If someone dismisses your feelings and you go quiet, they learn that dismissing you costs them nothing. Your silence becomes the reward. It becomes the signal that they can continue without interruption. Over time, this shifts the power balance in the relationship. Power is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes power shows up in who feels free to speak and who feels afraid to. The narcissistic person continues expressing anger, opinions, and demands without hesitation. Meanwhile, you begin filtering yourself, you edit your words, you calculate risks, you rehearse conversations in your head and then decide not to have them. That imbalance grows quietly, but it grows steadily. As the imbalance deepens, the narcissist's sense of control expands. They may start making bigger decisions without consulting you. They may become more openly dismissive. They may interrupt you more, correct you more, criticize you more, not necessarily because they consciously plan to dominate you, but because the dynamic has taught them they can. The absence of resistance feels like permission. There is also something else that happens when your silence becomes their power. They begin to rewrite the narrative. If you never object, they may later claim you never had a problem with it. If you never correct false accusations, they may say, see, you didn't even deny it. Your quiet becomes evidence in their story, and because narcissistic individuals often rely on controlling the narrative, your lack of response makes that task easier for them. Meanwhile, something internal shifts inside you. Each time you silence yourself, you override your own instincts. You feel the discomfort, you feel the unfairness, but you swallow it. The message you send yourself is subtle but powerful. My feelings are not important enough to express. When that message repeats over months or years, it reshapes your self-concept. You may start believing that speaking up is selfish, dramatic, or dangerous. The narcissistic person, however, experiences the opposite effect. Their confidence in their dominance grows. Their entitlement solidifies. They feel increasingly justified in their behavior because it is never meaningfully challenged. This is how small dismissals can turn into chronic disrespect. This is how occasional manipulation can evolve into consistent control. It does not happen overnight. It happens in increments of silence. It is important to understand that this does not mean you are weak. Silence is often a survival strategy. If you have learned that speaking up leads to punishment, of course you will protect yourself. Of course you will try to reduce conflict, but survival strategies that work in the short term can become harmful in the long term. What once protected you begins to cost you. The longer the silence continues, the more the narcissist occupies emotional space in the relationship. Their moods dictate the atmosphere. Their reactions determine what topics are safe. Their comfort becomes the priority. And without ever formally agreeing to it, you find yourself living in their emotional territory. This is how silence turns into power. Not because you handed it over intentionally, but because in the absence of boundaries, the most dominant personality will fill the space. And in narcissistic dynamics, that dominance rarely softens on its own. It expands until something interrupts it. Silence may feel like peace, but when it consistently shields harmful behavior from accountability, it becomes the foundation on which that behavior stands. When you stay silent in a narcissistic dynamic, something subtle but deeply destabilizing begins to happen. Your sense of reality starts to shift. Not all at once, not in some dramatic, obvious way. It happens gradually through repetition, confusion, and self-suppression. And the longer it continues, the more disoriented you may begin to feel. At the core of many narcissistic dynamics is gaslighting, the denial, distortion, or rewriting of events in a way that benefits the narcissistic person. You may clearly remember what was said, how something happened, or how you felt in a particular moment. But when you bring it up, you are told it didn't happen that way, or that you misunderstood, or that you are too sensitive. If you respond with silence instead of challenging the distortion, something important shifts internally. You start holding two realities at once, what you experienced and what they insist is true. At first, you may be confident in your memory. You may think, no, I know what I heard. But if every attempt to clarify is met with dismissal, defensiveness, or blame, you may begin to question whether it is worth the effort. So you stop correcting them. You stop defending your version of events, and that is when reality begins to blur. Silence in the face of distortion creates cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable psychological tension between what you know and what you are being told. If you do not resolve that tension by asserting your experience, your mind will try to resolve it another way. Often that way is self-doubt. It feels easier to think, maybe I'm mistaken, than to constantly battle someone who refuses to acknowledge your truth. Over time, that maybe it becomes probably. You may start replaying conversations in your head, trying to analyze every detail. Did I misunderstand? Was my tone wrong? Am I exaggerating? This constant mental reviewing is exhausting. It keeps your nervous system activated, and because you are not openly challenging the distortion, the narcissistic narrative becomes louder and more established. Another shift happens in how you interpret your own emotions. If you feel hurt and are told you are overreacting, but you say nothing in response, you begin to disconnect from the validity of your feelings. You may still feel the hurt, but you stop trusting it. You start evaluating your emotions through their lens rather than your own. Instead of asking, why did that hurt me, you ask, is it wrong that I feel hurt? This is how emotional self-trust erodes. You become less certain of your instincts. You hesitate before expressing discomfort. You second-guess your reactions. And eventually, you may reach a point where you genuinely do not know whether your perceptions are accurate. That confusion is not accidental. It is the natural consequence of repeatedly silencing your perspective in a dynamic where your reality is frequently challenged. There is also a long-term impact on your identity. Our sense of self is shaped by how we interpret our experiences. When someone consistently overrides your interpretation and you do not resist it, their version of reality begins to influence your self-concept. If they say you are dramatic, you may begin seeing yourself as dramatic. If they say you are forgetful, you may start believing you have a bad memory. These labels settle in quietly when they are not questioned. The more this happens, the more dependent you may become on the narcissistic person for clarity. You might find yourself asking them to confirm details of events. You might rely on their memory instead of your own. That dependency deepens the imbalance in the relationship. They become the authority on what is real. And that is an enormous amount of psychological power to give someone. Silence also prevents external reality testing. When you do not talk about what is happening with trusted friends, family, or a therapist, you lose opportunities for perspective. You remain inside the closed system of the narcissistic dynamic, and inside that system, their narrative dominates. Without outside input, it becomes harder to see patterns clearly. You may even start minimizing incidents automatically. It wasn't that bad. They didn't mean it. I'm making it bigger than it is. This internal minimization becomes a habit. It protects you from constant conflict, but it distances you from your authentic experience. Over time, the blurring of reality can create anxiety. When you cannot fully trust your perceptions, the world feels less stable. You may feel unsure in other areas of life, not just in the relationship. Decision-making becomes harder, you hesitate more, you look for reassurance more often. That uncertainty can spread beyond the original dynamic. It is important to understand that this confusion does not mean you are weak or incapable. It means you have been in an environment where your perceptions were repeatedly challenged and where speaking up did not feel safe or productive. The human mind adapts to survive. Sometimes that adaptation looks like self-doubt, but the longer silence continues, the more your internal compass weakens. Reality does not just blur in isolated moments, it becomes foggy in a broader sense. You start living in a space where you are never quite sure whether your thoughts, feelings, and memories are valid. And that is one of the most destabilizing experiences a person can have, not knowing if they can trust their own mind. When you consistently stay silent in the face of narcissistic behavior, your boundaries do not simply bend, they slowly disappear. And this does not happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly through small concessions, repeated compromises, and the gradual normalization of what once felt unacceptable. Boundaries are the psychological lines that define what is okay and what is not okay for you. They reflect your values, your limits, your emotional needs, and your sense of self-respect. In healthy relationships, boundaries are acknowledged and negotiated. They may not always be perfectly honored, but they are respected enough to be discussed. In narcissistic dynamics, however, boundaries are often treated as obstacles rather than guidelines. The first time a boundary is crossed, you likely notice it immediately. You feel the discomfort in your body. Maybe it is a sarcastic comment that cuts a little too deep. Maybe it is a private detail shared publicly. Maybe it is a dismissal of your feelings. In that moment, you have an internal signal that something is not right. But if speaking up leads to defensiveness, mockery, or blame shifting, you may decide it is not worth addressing. So you let it go. That decision feels small, temporary, practical, but it sends a powerful message both to them and to yourself. To them, it communicates that the boundary is flexible. To yourself, it communicates that your discomfort is negotiable. The next time it happens, it feels slightly less shocking, still uncomfortable but familiar. You may rationalize it more quickly. They're just stressed. They didn't mean it that way. It's not a big deal. And again, you remain silent. With each repetition, the line moves a little further. What once felt like a clear violation starts to feel like part of the relationship's personality. You adapt, you adjust, you recalibrate your expectations. This is how normalization works. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition without resistance. Over time, you may notice that you tolerate things you once promised yourself you never would. Perhaps you said you would never stay with someone who belittles you. Yet now, subtle insults are part of daily conversation. Maybe you believed mutual respect was non-negotiable. Yet now, your opinions are routinely dismissed. The shift is so gradual that it does not always register as a shift. There is also an internal erosion happening. Every time you override your instinct to protect your boundary, you weaken your connection to that instinct. The voice inside you that says, "This doesn't feel right," grows quieter, not because it disappears, but because you have trained yourself not to act on it. You begin to doubt whether your boundaries are reasonable. You may start thinking you are too demanding or too sensitive for wanting basic respect. In narcissistic dynamics, boundaries are often reframed as personal attacks. If you say, "That comment hurt me," you might be accused of being dramatic. If you say, "Please don't speak to me that way," you might be told you are controlling. After enough of these reactions, you may start associating boundary setting with conflict, guilt, or shame. Silence then feels safer than asserting yourself. But silence does not protect your boundaries, it dissolves them. As boundaries fade, the dynamic becomes increasingly one-sided. The narcissistic person's preferences, moods, and needs dominate. Your preferences become secondary. You may find yourself agreeing to plans you do not enjoy, accepting behavior you dislike, or suppressing opinions that might trigger disagreement. The relationship begins revolving around their comfort zone. Another subtle consequence is that your tolerance threshold expands in ways that are not healthy. You may start enduring emotional volatility, criticism, or unpredictability that would have once felt intolerable. Because you have adapted incrementally, you do not always see how far the line has moved. If someone from the outside observed the dynamic, they might recognize the imbalance immediately. But from the inside, it feels gradual and confusing. This erosion also affects your sense of identity. Boundaries are closely tied to self-definition. When you consistently uphold them, you reinforce who you are and what you stand for. When you repeatedly abandon them, you begin to lose clarity about your own standards. You may struggle to answer simple questions like, what do I need, or what is important to me? Because you have spent so much time prioritizing someone else's framework, the disappearance of boundaries does not usually result in peace. It often results in resentment, exhaustion, and quiet frustration. You may feel taken for granted or invisible, but struggle to pinpoint exactly why. The reason is that the original lines that defined mutual respect have been erased so slowly that you cannot identify the moment they vanished. It is important to understand that this process is not a reflection of weakness. It is often a reflection of adaptation. Humans are wired to preserve connection and reduce conflict, especially in close relationships. But when preserving connection consistently requires sacrificing your boundaries, the cost becomes your sense of self. The longer silence continues, the harder it becomes to reestablish those lines. Not because you are incapable, but because the dynamic has become accustomed to their absence. Reintroducing boundaries can feel disruptive. It can provoke resistance, and that fear of disruption keeps many people quiet. Yet the absence of boundaries is not stability. It is imbalance, and imbalance over time reshapes how you see yourself and what you believe you deserve. When you stay silent in a narcissistic dynamic, resentment does not disappear, it accumulates. It settles quietly beneath the surface, layer by layer, until it becomes a constant emotional undercurrent in your life. You may believe that by not speaking up, you are keeping things calm, but unexpressed hurt does not dissolve. It transforms. At first, the resentment is small. It might show up as mild irritation after a dismissive comment or a sarcastic remark that felt unnecessary. You notice it, but you tell yourself it is not worth addressing. Maybe you are tired. Maybe you do not want another circular argument. So you push it down and move forward. But every time you silence your reaction, you store the emotional residue. The mind keeps track even when you try not to. You may consciously forgive or overlook an incident, but emotionally, something remains unresolved. That unresolved tension does not vanish just because you decided not to confront it. Over time, these small moments accumulate. The dismissals, the broken promises, the subtle put-downs, the lack of accountability. Individually, they may seem manageable. Together, they form a pattern, and that pattern begins to weigh on you. Resentment often manifests physically before you fully recognize it emotionally. You might feel a tightness in your chest when they enter the room. You might notice a drop in energy during conversations. You may feel chronically fatigued without understanding why. Emotional suppression is not neutral for the body. It requires effort to continuously override your natural responses. There is also a growing sense of injustice that accompanies resentment. Even if you never articulate it out loud, part of you recognizes the imbalance. You may think, I am always the one adjusting. I am always the one staying quiet. I am always the one letting things go. That awareness can create a quiet anger that simmers beneath daily interactions. But because direct confrontation has historically led to defensiveness or escalation, that anger has nowhere safe to go. So it turns inward. You may become more self-critical. You may blame yourself for feeling frustrated. Or the resentment may leak out indirectly through sarcasm, passive-aggressive comments, emotional withdrawal, or sudden outbursts that seem disproportionate to the moment. This is what buried resentment does. It does not stay neatly contained. It distorts your emotional landscape. Another consequence is emotional numbness. When you repeatedly silence your hurt, your system may adapt by dampening emotional intensity altogether. You may feel less reactive, but you may also feel less joyful, less engaged, less connected. Emotional suppression is not selective. When you mute pain, you often mute pleasure as well. You might start feeling detached in conversations. You may find it harder to be affectionate or enthusiastic. The relationship can begin to feel mechanical, like you are performing rather than participating. And because you have not expressed the underlying resentment, the narcissistic person may have little awareness of how disconnected you feel. Resentment also changes how you interpret neutral events. A simple comment may feel loaded because it connects to a long history of unresolved incidents. A minor disagreement may trigger a disproportionate emotional reaction because it is sitting on top of months or years of suppressed frustration. You may even surprise yourself with how intensely you react in certain moments. In narcissistic dynamics, resentment is often compounded by the lack of accountability. When someone rarely acknowledges harm or takes responsibility, closure does not occur. Without acknowledgement, there is no repair. Without repair, there is no release. The emotional wound remains open, even if it looks closed on the surface. Over time, you may begin questioning why you feel so irritated or distant. You might think, why am I always on edge? Or why do I feel so drained after spending time with them? The answer is not necessarily constant conflict. It is often the emotional labor of containment, constantly managing your reactions, monitoring your tone, choosing silence over expression. Chronic resentment can also affect your broader mental health. It may contribute to anxiety as you remain hyper-aware of potential triggers. It may contribute to low mood as you feel trapped in a dynamic where your needs are consistently sidelined. The emotional energy required to suppress your truth is substantial. Eventually, resentment can reach a breaking point. Sometimes it erupts in a single explosive confrontation. Other times it leads to emotional withdrawal so deep that you no longer feel invested. In either case, the relationship suffers, not because you are overly sensitive, but because unaddressed hurt has been allowed to compound. It is important to recognize that resentment is not a flaw in your character. It is a signal. It indicates that something important has been repeatedly ignored or violated. Silence may feel like a strategy to preserve stability, but when it consistently requires you to swallow legitimate feelings, it creates an internal imbalance. You cannot indefinitely silence yourself without emotional consequences. The feelings you refuse to express do not disappear. They settle into the foundation of the relationship. And over time, that foundation becomes heavy, tense, and fragile, not because you spoke up, but because you did not. When you remain silent in the presence of narcissistic behavior, escalation is not always loud at first. It is incremental, it is subtle, it often hides behind familiarity, but over time, the absence of accountability creates the perfect conditions for the behavior to intensify. Narcissistic patterns thrive in environments where there are no meaningful consequences. If someone dismisses your feelings and nothing changes, the dismissal becomes easier the next time. If someone interrupts you constantly and you stop trying to finish your sentences, interruption becomes the norm. Human behavior is shaped by reinforcement. When a behavior achieves its goal, dominance, control, avoidance of responsibility, and meets no resistance, it becomes stronger. At the beginning of the dynamic, the behavior may appear mild. Perhaps it is occasional sarcasm or subtle superiority. You might notice the edge in their tone, but you brush it off. When you do not challenge it, that edge becomes sharper. What once felt like a rare moment of insensitivity becomes a consistent communication style. Escalation does not always mean explosive rage. It can mean growing entitlement. It can mean increased criticism. It can mean more frequent invalidation. It can mean decisions being made without consulting you. The narcissistic person begins operating with greater confidence in their position of control because the pattern has taught them that their behavior will not disrupt the relationship. There is also a psychological shift happening within them. When someone is not confronted, they may interpret the silence as agreement. They may believe their perception is unquestionably correct. This reinforces grandiosity and reduces empathy. Why reflect on your impact if no one is openly objecting to it? Why adjust your behavior if it appears to be tolerated? In some cases, escalation can move from emotional invalidation to more overt forms of control. You may notice increased monitoring of your time, your social interactions, or your choices. Comments may become more cutting. Boundaries may be crossed more boldly. The subtle becomes explicit. One reason escalation occurs is that narcissistic individuals often test limits. Early in the relationship, there may be small boundary violations. If those are met with silence, the implicit message is that the limit can be pushed further. Each time the line moves without resistance, the testing continues. It becomes a process of gradual expansion. Another factor is boredom with stability. In some narcissistic dynamics, calm periods are short-lived. If there is no conflict, it may be unconsciously created. When silence suppresses tension rather than resolving it, the tension does not disappear. It resurfaces in new forms. This can look like picking arguments, provoking reactions, or creating drama where none existed before. As escalation continues, your threshold for what feels normal shifts. You adapt to the new baseline. What would have once shocked you now feels routine. This normalization makes it harder to identify just how much the dynamic has changed. You may look back months or years later and realize the level of disrespect or control has significantly increased. Escalation also affects the emotional climate of the relationship. You may feel increasingly cautious. You may spend more time anticipating reactions and less time expressing yourself freely. The unpredictability can intensify, even if the behavior itself becomes more consistent. The atmosphere grows heavier. It is important to understand that escalation is not caused by your silence alone. The underlying traits and patterns already exist, but silence removes friction, and without friction, problematic behavior gains momentum. Accountability acts as a boundary. Without it, there is little to interrupt the progression. In some situations, escalation may include public undermining, harsher criticism, or more overt emotional manipulation. If earlier tactics were effective, there is little incentive to scale them back. The dynamic can become increasingly unbalanced, with one person dominating conversations, decisions, and emotional space. You may find yourself thinking it wasn't always this bad, and you are likely right. Escalation is rarely immediate. It grows through repetition. It grows through tolerance. It grows when discomfort is repeatedly absorbed rather than addressed. The longer the silence continues, the more entrenched the pattern becomes, and once a pattern is entrenched, shifting it requires significantly more effort than it would have earlier. The narcissistic person may resist change more strongly because the existing dynamic serves them well. Silence may begin as a strategy to maintain peace, but over time it can unintentionally contribute to the very instability you are trying to avoid. When harmful behavior meets no resistance, it does not remain static. It expands to fill the available space. Escalation is not always explosive. Sometimes it is simply the steady intensification of imbalance, until one day you realize the relationship feels profoundly different from how it began. When you stay silent for a long time in a narcissistic dynamic, something deeply personal begins to happen. You start becoming smaller. Not physically, not visibly in an obvious way, but psychologically, emotionally, and relationally. You begin shrinking parts of yourself to maintain stability, and over time that shrinking becomes a way of life. At first, the changes are subtle. You might hesitate before sharing an opinion that you know could trigger disagreement. You may soften your language, add disclaimers, or preface your thoughts with "this might be silly," but you are not doing this because you lack intelligence or confidence. You are doing it because you have learned that direct expression can lead to dismissal, correction, or conflict. So you adjust. Maybe you stop telling certain stories because they were previously interrupted or minimized. Maybe you avoid discussing achievements because they were met with competition rather than celebration. Maybe you keep your frustrations to yourself because past attempts to discuss them led to blame being redirected back at you. Each of these decisions feels practical in the moment. It feels easier to adapt than to argue, but every adaptation trims something off your authentic self. Over time, you may begin filtering your personality. You think carefully about what topics are safe. You measure your tone. You monitor your facial expressions. You try not to appear too emotional, too opinionated, too enthusiastic, too anything. The goal becomes minimizing friction. The cost becomes self-expression. This shrinking often happens unconsciously. You do not wake up one day and decide to be smaller. It develops through repeated experiences of invalidation or overshadowing. When someone consistently dominates conversations, you speak less. When your ideas are routinely dismissed, you stop offering them. When your feelings are framed as overreactions, you stop revealing them. Gradually, the relationship's emotional space becomes uneven. One voice feels expansive, the other feels restricted. You may also notice that you begin prioritizing their comfort over your authenticity. You choose words carefully to avoid bruising their ego. You avoid expressing needs that might be labeled as too much. You anticipate their reactions and adjust yourself accordingly. This constant self-monitoring consumes emotional energy. As you shrink in the relationship, you may also shrink socially. You might pull back from friends or family, either because the narcissistic person criticizes them or because you feel embarrassed discussing the dynamic. You may isolate yourself unintentionally. The smaller your world becomes, the easier it is for the dynamic to define your reality. Another shift that often occurs is the loss of spontaneity. When you are constantly calculating potential reactions, it becomes harder to act naturally. Humor feels riskier, vulnerability feels dangerous, even joy may feel muted if it could provoke jealousy or competition. You start living in a measured way rather than an expressive one. This shrinking can deeply affect your self-esteem. Confidence grows when expression is welcomed and respected. It diminishes when expression is punished or ignored. If your contributions are frequently overshadowed, you may start believing they are not valuable. If your emotions are routinely invalidated, you may begin questioning their legitimacy. The most painful part is that you might not immediately recognize the extent of the change. You may simply feel more quiet than you used to. Less decisive, less vibrant. You might think stress or age is responsible, but often it is the cumulative effect of self-silencing. There can also be a growing internal conflict. Part of you wants to speak up, to take up space, to assert your needs. Another part fears the consequences. That internal tug-of-war creates tension, and when the fearful part wins repeatedly, the expressive part grows weaker from lack of use. Over time, you may struggle to identify what you truly want. When you have spent months or years adapting to someone else's preferences, your own preferences can feel blurry. You may answer questions with, "I don't mind," or "whatever you want," not because you are easygoing, but because you are disconnected from your own desires. Becoming smaller is not about losing volume, it is about losing visibility, even to yourself. You begin living in a way that prioritizes harmony over authenticity. But harmony built on self-erasure is fragile. It is important to understand that this shrinking is not a character flaw. It is a protective adaptation. When speaking fully leads to pain, you instinctively reduce exposure. The human nervous system is designed to minimize threat. If authenticity feels threatening in a relationship, it will be dialed down. But long-term self-minimization has consequences. It can lead to feelings of invisibility, loneliness, and quiet resentment. You may feel unseen even when you are physically present. You may long for recognition but feel unsure how to reclaim it. The longer silence continues, the more entrenched the smaller version of you becomes. And the more distant you may feel from the person you once were, the one who spoke freely, laughed loudly, expressed opinions confidently, and trusted that there was space for them.